Hey, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of The Daily Objective. And due to some technical troubles, we are streaming this directly to YouTube first rather than Facebook. But make sure to follow The Daily Objective on both mediums so you never miss a moment. We have something to discuss today that you've probably heard about, or maybe you didn't. It's Israel's new peace deal with United Arab Emirates, which my initial response was honestly, who cares? Why are you telling me? I don't care. But at best, I figured, hey, you know what? This is probably pretty good. It's they're normalizing peaceful coexistence with Israel in the Middle East, which might lead to a general trend towards Western values. What I mean is capitalism, individual rights, rule of law, as opposed to rule of clerics or of despots, rule of law. So generally, my response was, who cares? And this might be kind of good. But our guest today is a guy who has a lot to say about this topic. So I'm looking forward to learning more. And he's a guy who you might not recognize and frankly might not even trust. But he's actually the inventor. He's the creator of the Ayn Rand Center UK, which makes him a very influential person in the UK and therefore the world. Although we couldn't book our usual host, Nikos Sotorikopoulos, today. He wishes to inform you all that I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But please welcome a guest that I am excited to have on, Razi Ginzberg.
Hey, Rucka, thanks. And yeah, well, not influential enough in the UK because I think, we have a lot of work to do. And this sort of peace deal is and the way it's being received by everybody shows that we have a lot of work to do. What I'm going to say about it, unfortunately, I haven't heard anywhere. So let's start with Israel's historical attempts to have peace. I mean, this started when Israel announced its independence and basically accepted the UN partition plan, wanted to have peace with its Arab neighbors. As soon as it announced independence, it was attacked. That happened again and again. After every war, Israel offers peace, and the other side always rejected it. That was until 1979, when Egypt, which had lost every single war with Israel, agreed to give Israel peace in exchange for some of the territory it lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. So this sort of land for peace principle in negotiations in the Middle East has been around ever since the idea of peace has been discussed. In this case, Israel didn't actually give land to the UAE because there were no such demands, but there was also no war. It's a very Israeli thing to do, to surrender when you're not even at war. And that's what Israel is doing. It basically after Trump announced his Middle East peace plan, Israel, which was in the midst of an election campaign back then, the leaders of both major parties said that based on that plan, they will annex large parts of the West Bank. Those two leaders are now sitting together in the coalition government that has signed this deal. The deal is the UAE gives Israel peace in exchange for Israel not annexing these territories. So once again, this very problematic principle. I mean, true peace is something that both sides want, and that is what you get in exchange. You get peace. You get the end of a conflict. So here there was no conflict. We're getting this. Israel is getting to show the world once again how it makes overtures towards its Arab neighbors and other countries in the region, and and this is what they get. Just one point on this idea that you look at the Middle East. I think rational people look at the Middle East and say, Israel, for all its flaws, is clearly the beacon of at least hope in that region. So you would think Israel, signing a deal and having diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, a country where homosexuality is illegal, and I think technically, at least on the books, can be punished by death. There's no free speech. There's something that's borderline slave labor, for people coming from third world countries. Uh, there's it's not a good place, despite the nice pictures we see of skyscrapers. It's not a good place. But this deal in the eyes of the world. It's not Israel giving legitimacy to this horrible regime. It's the other way around. It's them giving legitimacy to Israel. That's why you see countries condemning it. Turkey's president said he's considering downgrading relations with the UAE for doing this, even though Turkey has diplomatic relations with Israel. So, yeah, everything about this is upside down. And yeah, I can go on, but yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: like, can you give us a little bit more context, like how should rational people look at Israel? Because it's called a Jewish state. It sounds like kind of a religious theocracy, kind of like you need to be a certain religion to get in, or else sort of an ethno state, like you need to be a certain race to qualify. So when people hear you say, "Oh, Israel is like the one good player in the Middle East," like they're in today's culture, in today's environment, a lot of people take exception to that. How do you see Israel?
Yeah, so I did say for all its flaws, and yeah, there are many flaws. There are many things that Israel could be better at. I think if it was, another country in Europe, it would not be one of the better ones. It would probably be one of the worst ones. But compared to other European countries, but compared to the countries in the region in which it exists, uh, yeah, as I mentioned, the things I listed about the United Arab Emirates are not exclusive to them. Homosexuality, I think, is illegal in all Arab countries, or all but maybe one. I'm not sure about that. It's definitely frowned upon in the culture. Women are considered sort of inferior to men. And yeah, you don't have free speech anywhere. So these are all very bad regimes, and Israel has these elements of Western culture and civilization that, again, if nothing else, they give you hope that there might be something better in that region.
Yeah, Israel has rule of law. Now, as much as a modern country can have rule of law when it's got a lobby system, when it's got a mixture of capitalism and state control. So much like the US, and the US has a long history now of the government violating people's rights, whether it's in business or at times even when it comes to free speech, which is written explicitly in our amendments to the Constitution. So when it comes to Western countries, we judge them primarily by their flaws, I've noticed. So we're furious at America, we're furious at Israel. Constantly, Western countries are called racist hellholes, basically for their shortcomings, and at times even their exaggerations of their shortcomings. And that certainly seems to be the case with Israel, like you said, for all their flaws. Compared to the neighbors aggressing towards it, I mean, Israel has nothing to apologize when standing next to them. So Israel should not ever apologize to the UAE. Israel should be telling the UAE to get their own act together and to modernize. But explain to me, why is it that this peace deal is okay? Actually, so you mentioned the annexation of the West Bank. A lot of people hear that, including me, aren't really sure how to feel about that, or even it sounds like land is being appropriated. It sounds like Israel's flaws are coming to the surface. Like, you got people living, they've got homes, they've got life being conducted in the West Bank, and Israel is now expanding its borders. I mean, since when is that acceptable? So what do you have to say about annexation in general, and then how it relates to the UAE?
Yeah, so annexation would have been of the parts of the West Bank where Jews live, and parts where nobody lives. It wasn't like they would take Palestinian cities and say this is now a part of Israel. And remember, the West Bank is land that Israel didn't want. It was won in a war that Israel was not only forced into, but actually, the Jordanian front, where on which Israel won the West Bank. Israel was basically telling Jordan, look, we just finished up the Egyptians and the Syrians. It's over. Don't get into this. We'll leave you alone if you don't join the war. But the Jordanians, have always been, militarily less, intelligent than other countries, even in that region. And they chose to go to that war. They lost that land. They never wanted it back. They have peace with Israel that doesn't include them getting the West Bank back. Israel offered the Palestinians all sorts of sovereignty and control and a state, and they rejected every single deal. So and they reject it, and they attack, and they attack civilians. So I absolutely think Israel should annex the as much of the territories as it can. Long term, I would also annex Palestinian cities, because I don't think a Palestinian state is in any way a viable way forward if you want to have peace between Israel and its neighbors. Yeah, there was something else.
I mean, now people hear you say that. They hear you say long term you want Israel to annex Palestinian cities. They say, whoa, 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 slow down, Dr. Strangelove, as Bill O'Reilly once told our hero and teacher Leonard Peikoff. Also speaking about foreign policy in a different context. But I mean, when you say Israel should annex Palestinian cities, doesn't that sound like Israel going out of their way to take land away or to interject? Like I mean, what would that look like in practice? Like, what would that look like once the whole area is Israel? Don't you have a bunch of Palestinians? First of all, voting. So now the Israelis have like self-hating Israelis voting against Israel and transforming its politics. But also, isn't that an unprovoked act of aggression? A lot of people would ask.
No, it's very much provoked, and I say in the long term, and I mean very long term.
Very long term. Yeah.
From today, when I look into the future, 10, 15 years, I think this is more likely or less unlikely than any deal in which there's a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza, right on the border with Israel and covering much of Israel's territory. And yeah, that's not viable if Israeli security is a part of the deal, which that's a question mark. But if it is, then I would say a Palestinian state is off the table. And again, if Palestinian culture changes completely, they all read Ayn Rand, they embrace objectivism. Yeah, I'm all for it, and I'd say the Israelis should learn from them in that situation.
When it comes to kind of hoping to see the Middle East sort of modernize, like, we need to keep in mind as students of philosophy and the history of philosophy, like at this point, we're hoping the Arabs surpass their Western counterparts. Like we're hoping the Arab world and the Persians and the Indians, like we're hoping all these people in regions where there's trouble and anti-Western hostility. I don't even know if India is in that category, but nonetheless, it's like we're hoping that they skip past the modern philosophers that have brought us this anti-Western mentality that prevails in the West. You go to any university in the West, you learn America is the worst thing to ever happen to this planet. Capitalism is the worst system that's ever been devised. The individual cannot think independently. We're taught it's not taken seriously to suggest that the individual can be objective, must be objective and independent in his life, and should be politically free to do so, or that America is the most noble country where the future relies upon America kind of just getting back to its founding principles. The West has abandoned these ideas a long time ago, but in kind of hoping that a place like UAE modernizes, we're basically hoping they sort of get more advanced than America and Israeli intellectuals at this point. It's Israel and it's America and it's UK and it's all the Western countries that need to sort of rethink their philosophical positions and get back to what makes the West a place worth defending, what makes the West a place worth living in. And then I think you would see the rest of the world sort of follow suit.
Yeah, I mean, when you say we're hoping they'll surpass us, right now we're doing, the West is doing more than hope. I mean, we're actively, going backwards to make it easier for them to surpass us, which I don't think is, as you mentioned, the right way. Would have been the opposite way. Um, but yeah, I mean, look, in the UAE, you have, places that look very, very Western, because they allow Westerners in. They have, it's a different world. If you come from the US or the UK, than if you come from India to work in construction. Um, so yeah, it's not a good country, even if some pictures make it look good. And by the way, one of the things that sort of brought Israel and the UAE together is Iran, and this has been mentioned in the news. Like, Iran is a part of it. Both countries, as well as other countries in the region, don't want Iran to have a nuclear bomb. But you don't need to have diplomatic relations for that. You don't need to, have trade with them, and have an embassy there, and for them to have an embassy in Israel, which I'm going to take a wild guess and say that's going to be in Tel Aviv, not in Israel's capital, Jerusalem. But we'll see. But you don't need that, and you don't need that, with Saudi Arabia as well, which is now a kind of ally of Israel in this, potential war against Iran. What you need, and this is what Israel has given up on a long time ago, is to show the strength that you actually have. And if Israel was to go and bomb Iran, and would need to use Saudi airspace or Emirate airspace, you let them know. You let them know you're going to this common enemy. You tell them, you can tell them the flight path. You can tell them, we're entering your airspace. This is where we're going. We have no interest in bombing you on this particular occasion. We're going to bomb our mutual enemy, and let us through, and don't let anybody know. If you act against us, we will consider that an act of war and retaliate. So yeah, you don't need to give legitimacy to really an illegitimate regime in order to solve the Iran problem, which, by the way, Israel has been talking about for 20 years and has done nothing. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't believe that that's coming up anytime soon.
Yeah, when I said it's like we're hoping the Arab nations advance past us, I meant like philosophically, we're hoping they kind of figure out what it is that you and I are trying to spread here in the West. It's like that's what it would take, because the more the Arab world is influenced by the West, currently, it's of course intellectually is the primary way that cultures influence one another. And what are they getting when they send, and have they been getting for centuries, when wealthy and powerful Arab leaders or just Arab people send their kids to study in the West? They learn the West is evil, capitalism is evil, and tribalism is noble, and the indigenous peoples of the world are righteous and are victims of the West. So that's what I meant. Like, it's like we're hoping they sort of outgrow that mentality before we here in Western countries realize that. So, I mean, altruism is serious business. That's what I think people fail to understand. Kind of once you see things through that lens, you understand that, like, America, Israel, England, every fairly free country feels guilty for its own prosperity, for its own individualism, to the extent that it has an element of individualism. We do philosophically tend to see tribal cultures as superior. And it's why we're seeing people in the West grow increasingly tribal. That is, philosophically, we see that as a better instance of altruism. And altruism is serious business. People are driven by what they believe to be the moral way. Now, Israel, like any Western country, feels guilty for its own success, for its own strength. It's constantly, the Israelis are constantly apologizing for any instance of self-defense, and bragging about how many enemy territories they've spared when trying to track down. Now, I mean, this is really going to sound, I mean, this might even get us removed from YouTube for saying it. When Israel responds to acts of aggression in a place like Lebanon, one might say they should include religious clerics that are advising, Hezbollah. I mean, is that
Yeah.
yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean,
I would start by actually eliminating Hezbollah itself, which
right.
Israel could have done in 2006, but chose not to, again, because it's the most moral army in the world, as they keep telling us. And what that means is they spare civilians on the other side at the cost of winning the war and at the cost of lives on their side.
Yeah, and people who sort of hold that altruist premise, even people who might call themselves libertarian, a lot of them, they sort of hold this premise that, yeah, the West needs to sort of apologize. Western countries need to apologize for their own success, their wealth, their strength. Western governments can't be trusted because governments as such are evil. So they think when you mock Israel for calling themselves the moral army, they say, oh, of course Israel is immoral. Look how much damage, look how much carnage they're causing. But you and I we're hypercritical of Israel from coming from the opposite place. The job of a free country's government is to protect the citizens, the individuals, their lives and property, and their right to speak and act freely in that country. And when faced with aggression, that it's the job of that country, such as Israel or America, or hopefully a future UAE and future maybe even Palestinian government. I mean, it's up to that, completely up to them. The way you and I see it, it's up to them the route they choose to go. It's the job of a government to protect the rights of the individuals living within it. So Israel, the blood, one could even say the blood of many Israelis is at this point on the hands of the Israeli government for neglecting their duty, for failing to live up to their job, which is to make it clear to aggressors, to make it clear to neighboring entities that are attacking them that shenanigans will not be tolerated. So I know we're just about out of time, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Unfortunately, in Israel, it's not even that this is the policy of the government and you hear, some strong opposition to it or some, semi-fringe opposition to it. There is no argument saying, look, the lives of our soldiers in a war that we would rather not fight is more important, should be more important, and is more valuable to us than lives even of innocent people on the other side. And again, we spoke about this less than a week ago, but Israel keeps throwing these things at us that, we can make this a weekly segment about what Israel has done wrong this week. Yeah, Israel continues to pride itself on the sacrificing of its own soldiers.
Yeah, so altruism is serious business. Philosophy is heavy machinery, as I like to say. And there are consequences to what the intellectuals derive, to what the intellectuals conclude from their lecterns in their classrooms. These have real life consequences. And when you look at the lack of confidence that Israel has in self-defense, and the same is true of any Western country, when you see that the Western countries of today, they don't recognize individualism as a serious principle, you can see the consequences of philosophy. And this is why it's important that we consider a philosophy like objectivism, as Ayn Rand teaches us. And I would say to the Israelis, please, you really, so much of the Israeli mentality seems to be a sort of in the aftershocks of the Second World War, and so much rightful resentment at Germany. I would suggest to the Israelis, get the Germans out of your universities, or at least counter them with one Russian who moved to the US and happens to actually be of Jewish descent, if that gets her through your door. Ayn Rand. Read her books, take her seriously qua philosopher as well as qua novelist, and see where it takes you. That's all we're saying. Thank you, Razi. Go ahead. You have some final thoughts.
I would just say to Israelis, yeah, be quick about it. I think you have far less time than those of us in the US and the UK have.
Yeah, Israel, you guys are it's been said, I think it was said by one of the Zionist writers in the 19th century that, a normal person, when it starts raining, pulls out his umbrella and protects himself from the rain. A Jew, this writer said, gets pneumonia and then pulls out his umbrella. You guys, a comedian like me would say you guys have too much Jewish guilt. A philosopher might say you have sort of Western guilt, capitalist guilt, free country guilt. Israel, get your act together. My fellow Americans here, get your act together. And of course, you Britons over there, read Ayn Rand and, you know, get your act together, everybody. That's all we're saying. Thank you for joining us here on this very special YouTube live stream. We'll hopefully be back on Facebook live streams next week. And thank you, Razi, for the exceptional insight. And we'll see you all here soon again next week. Peace out.
Bye.